Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are live here at MythVision Podcast, and First Timothy is as real as a $3 bill. Before I introduce our guest here, who is a professor, he is a PhD, who also knows the New Testament quite well. I just want to make one little point, and I know this from all the research we've done here at MythVision. The academics, I love learning from critical scholarship and various voices on this, but there's one thing they have in common while they might disagree over little nuances and differences, and that is how common it was to write gospels, letters, create fictional accounts in Paul's name, and conversations between the Apostle Paul and other people. Paul was this almost archetype for different social identity groups in early Christianity. And anyone who is researching this, even the most staunch fundamentalist Orthodox Christian, who will have to look at Marcion and say, what a heretic, of course, is what their position would typically be if they're really radical, has to recognize how he is using Paul. So Paul becomes kind of this figure. For me, this is why I think there's a historical Paul to begin with. Why make up the complete guy out of thin air? But nonetheless, that's not the point of today's episode. Today's episode is going to show you forgeries are not only done in Paul's name as if Paul wrote them, but oftentimes are sophisticated. They're not just writing in Paul's name. You're going to see a scholar who's been dealing with this history behind these letters and forging and stuff, and we're going to dive deep. There's been Eric from Testify. I think he's watched the videos, and he kind of wants to show why we think this is a forgery. By the way, let me introduce our guest so that I'm not bloviating here at the intro. Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson, welcome back to MythVision. How are you?
I'm doing very well. And just so people know a bit about me, because my website isn't up to date, I am currently a lecturer in the Department of Classical Archaeology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and in the past I've taught a lot in religious studies and ancient history and other disciplines. I am not primarily a New Testament scholar.
Right.
But my undergraduate mentor, my thesis director as a bachelor's degree student 20 years ago, he was deeply embedded in this stuff. And so I recently came back to it after decades because I became interested in this stuff. So I'm more interested in the social historical context for early Christianity rather than the texts per se, but the texts are absolutely artifacts too. So we have to look at both the content of the texts and as well as who made them and where and why.
Let's give the context for this live stream first. What spawned this live stream? I'm flying back from California. I took my kids to Disneyland, and Joe says, hey, and for those who don't know, me and Joe are friendly, so we're friends. Yeah. He's like, call me Joe. Joe goes, we have to do a live stream and we have to do it this next week. And I'm like, okay, man, I'm in a jacuzzi going, all right, what's the time? When are you trying to, so what are we doing? And he's like, $3 bill. First Timothy's is fake. It's a $3. And I'm like, all right, this is great. I love the title. And then this morning I'm on my way to the gym. Me and the Queen of MythVision are in there walking. And I said, audiobook, Audible, BART EHRMAN, forgery, counter forgery, boom, found a chapter on Paul making up stuff, and holy freaking smokes, there's so much.
And Eric has made, I've looking into this because I was responding to one of Eric Manning's Testify videos that was just released, where he uses the undesigned coincidences as a way of defending the authenticity of the pastoral epistles, which are both of the epistles to Timothy and then the one to Titus. So these are being defended in this video using the undesigned coincidences. So my interest in this was because you had me looped into the chat feed for all your scholarly friends who are interested in debunking this idea of undesigned coincidences.
Yeah. So this is a secret society, everybody, just so everybody knows. We have like 15
So this is the second time I've taken a bite out of this apple. The last time we were way off in Asian religions with Jainism, which was its own weird thing. But today, the reason why is, again, I've published on the authenticity of 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, and the controversy about the relationship between that and the parallel passage in 1 Timothy. So that's where the real versus fake Paul comes into my work. And yeah, I just felt like I had to address this because I'm left scratching my head by this undesigned coincidence thing. And so I'm just going to hit a few of the issues. We could really talk all day. There's so many different aspects of the problem. And unfortunately, most of the time when people do it really quickly, they only refer to some of the evidence. They don't refer to the really big picture evidence. So if we have time today, we can get into the context of 2nd century, 3rd century Christianity, which is when these canonical norms are established, when which texts get chosen for the Pauline corpus that stand for Paul. And then you notice it's these disputed texts that in later years become go-to texts, right? Because they're the ones that have, it's the ones that are the least likely to be authentic, that have some of the most important like points of doctrine in them that make like really, so there's a reason, in other words, there's a reason they were forged. These forgeries did not just come out of a vacuum because people were bored.
I imagine you're going to cover this, Joe, but just to point out there, I hope everybody knows, not all Christians in the early church agreed on doctrines. Did you know that?
There you go. That's
Isn't
right.
that interesting?
That's exactly right.
It's these little basic things that you have to know how Paul gets used. And it's like saying, the president said to me, the president never said it, but if I have that authority backing me in my, in America or whatever, it might help my cause. But it's interesting to see both groups use Paul saying different things. So which is the real Paul? Will the real Paul please stand up, kind of thing. And I just want to point out, Eric Manning's a friend of mine, though I know a lot of people go, how? We definitely disagree on these things, but I'm hoping that he watches this and can enjoy what Joe brings to the table.
And by the way, I have no animosity whatsoever. I don't believe the undesigned coincidences stuff, but I think I'm glad we get a chance to talk about it. Cool. So thank you, Eric, for keeping this issue in the spotlight.
Awesome. Are we sharing screen now?
Yeah. If you want to go ahead and share, let me open mine and then I will go to full screen view.
Nice. Thanks to everybody who hit the like button today here, and hope you enjoyed this video.
So I have borrowed some little images out of Eric Manning's Testify video, which talk about the basics of how he's applying the undesigned coincidences concept to the question of the authenticity of the pastoral epistles, the latest and most disputed epistles attributed to Paul.
Are you playing your PowerPoint right now?
Yeah. Can you see it? It says
it's showing all the side panel thumbnails still on my.
Okay. That's strange. Okay. So I just exited out and coming back in. Let me see.
If you want, I can open it on my end if that helps.
No, let's see. So are you seeing the screen change now?
Nope. So it's
all right. I don't know why it says StreamYard is sharing a window.
And
if
I do it, I'll have to look at my phone to keep it.
Yeah, I understand that, which is really annoying. I understand, but on my end, it looks like it's working. So, nothing changed.
Nothing changed.
Sorry about that. Okay, so
you can play it, but they could see your thumbnails 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're on 5.
Yeah,
right now.
I can see that. So, you're clearly off. You're not at the beginning. So, unfortunately, when I go to the full view, it's not. So now, are you seeing the changes? You're seeing changes.
I'm seeing you change them, but I don't see the full screen PowerPoint. If you'd like, I could do it on my end.
It's up to you. It's about what you think works for. I don't know why it's not working because it looks like it's working on my end.
Yeah.
It looks proper.
Well, I'm going to do it on my end. You let me know, and we'll just roll with the punches. I'll look at my phone and stuff. All right, here we go. Yeah. All right. Let me know if you see full screen. We're going to start this bad boy and play from start. All right. Did it take the full screen up?
It's showing the same view as before with the thumbnails. And if the thumbnails don't bother people, we can just do it that way.
Well, I don't think it'll bother people.
Okay.
They just get a sneak peek. It's like spoiler alert, you know?
Yeah, but they're so small they probably can't. I can't read that. I have astigmatism. Oh, I do have my glasses here. But
I'm going to follow you then. Just
all right. Yeah. So essentially, though, the notion of the undesigned coincidences is that there are these tiny details that are offhand details that connect like puzzle pieces to other documents, and that they're done. Oh, what's that?
I had the wrong one up. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so they're like to connect like puzzle pieces to other documents, and they're presented as hallmarks of actual historical sources with historical evidence, as opposed to fantasy works like fiction. Fiction doesn't have undesigned coincidences. That first premise really rubs me the wrong way because I am a science fiction fan. So let me just describe, like, when I was a kid in the 80s, this was before Star Trek: The Next Generation came out. And, you would read Star Trek novels, and occasionally a Star Trek novelization would have a cameo from a science fiction character that wasn't even in the Star Trek universe. So, like, you'd be reading a Star Trek novelization, and then all of a sudden the TARDIS would show up in a background scene in the book. And you'd see, and the character described looking just like Doctor Who, the fourth Doctor with the scarf, would walk out of the TARDIS, do something, go back inside the TARDIS, and then the TARDIS would disappear. And it was just a little unofficial crossover in an official Star Trek novelization that was there for people like me who were sci-fi nerds who would recognize it, right?
Right.
But it was exactly like the undesigned coincidence in the sense that there was no like meaningful reason. It didn't drive the plot. It wasn't a central feature. It was just an insider's, you know what I mean? Like, It was a way for people in a subculture that are, sci-fi nerds to communicate, like you see that, right? It's like it's a background hook that's going to pass over most people's perception, especially if they're not familiar with both franchises, if that makes sense.
Got it.
So most of these examples of undesigned coincidences in the Pauline epistles and Acts, which is where he's talking about really the way that the pastoral epistles relate to the description of Paul's biography in Acts. These three epistles are synoptic, just like the synoptic gospels. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Why do we think that they're written by the same author who's different from? Why is they talk about the pastor as the right guy who wrote these three epistles as distinct from Paul? Because they hang together so tightly. They're like really, really literary interdependence. Now, to be fair, let me say I'm a skeptic that they're all by the same author because there's too many thematic differences between them. I think what happened is this, and I make this case in my earlier publication that we talked about a couple years ago, my publication in the journal Religions on 1 Corinthians. I think that the oldest of the three is either Titus or 2 Timothy. I think that those are the core. That Titus plus 2 Timothy is like the original duo of the pastoral epistles. I think the forgery of 1 Timothy is brazenly worse. It's more un-Pauline than either of them. And I think it uses both of them to craft itself. So my hypothesis is that 1 Timothy, why do I say it's the fakest of all of them? Why is it the least defensible? Like every other document, you can make a case that Paul wrote it, but I think the case for 1 Timothy is especially weak on numerous grounds. And I think that 1 Timothy is probably inspired by 1 Corinthians, Titus, and 2 Timothy. I think those are like the three main source texts that the forger of 1 Timothy is using. And there's direct literary dependence, right? And so why does 1 Timothy have the genre conventions of the second letter to Timothy, but it's got a lot of the content of Titus, sort of like it's Titus and First Timothy are like works of canon law. Second Timothy is a different genre. Second Timothy is a farewell discourse, right? So there's slightly different literary conventions, but in terms of the framing language, in terms of the way that the documents resemble each other, it's like a synoptic process where you're looking just the way that the synoptic gospels are written one at a time using the previous ones, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's the way the pastoral trilogy is. It's a synoptic trilogy, in my opinion, where the last author is not necessarily the same as the first author, but they form a chain of textual interdependence. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So most of these allegedly undesigned coincidences are directly derived by the forgery attempting to imitate the earlier sources plausibly. Why do you copy from them and change a little bit so that it seems plausible, so that your audience will buy it, right? It has to look like the other stuff close enough that that people will, it's like a fake Rembrandt. It has to look enough like a real Rembrandt that somebody's going to pay you the money that you're asking.
I can already, just real quick, two things. I can already hear the person going, "Oh, see, it sounds like it looks kind of like it, though." See, they're admitting,
right?
But we need to be on equal setting, starting out and saying, "Can we get all of those who are trying to push this as authentic to at least admit Christians in the early communities? They may not even call them Christians. I don't know how far they are in terms of their Christianity, like." I think when Christians identified as Christians, no matter if they were heretical, whatever the category is, they were Christians to me. But the point is people who claim to be Christians were doing this in Paul's name. If we can get at least equal footing, whether they think this is authentic or not, we need to have an agreement here. Because if they can't even go that far that they're making up letters, then we can't get anywhere to begin with. The other thing I was going to ask you is, are you changing your image, or is it still the first image right now?
It's still the first image, because I was just talking about the basic thing about undesigned coincidences. And so I'm skeptical of the concept because I think it's a redundancy. Coincidences that are designed are not coincidences. To design it means it's not a coincidence. If it's undesigned,
this is our problem with the Gospels. We see design, right?
These are designed coincidences, and therefore they are not coincidences. They are mostly forgers' tells. They're mostly the things that forgers do to cover their tracks and fail. And so let's just really quickly talk about the difference between mechanical linguistic interdependency versus the natural kind of stylometric similarity of the undisputed letters. So Paul's style doesn't have to be imitated. He doesn't have to contrive his own style. People have their own style and they sound like themselves naturally. So when you write multiple texts, they don't imitate each other. They just come from that authentic voice that you have. And so therefore they resemble each other in an organic way that doesn't require like close interdependence of phrasing. Whereas the forgeries have, in some ways, they're too similar, and in some ways they're too different. So they copy stock phrases and plug them in key locations where you're like, okay, that's too much like Paul. And then later on, right, they deviate as they're going into their own direction and making the changes they want to make. They're introducing the original content that the forgery is there to endorse, and that's where they go and a different way from Paul, right? So like it doesn't have that sort of natural similarity that you see between the undisputed epistles, which never directly imitate each other. They all do something slightly different, right? They all have their own unique purposes, their own unique contexts. Occasionally he might borrow a stock phrase here or there, or, say something similar to what he said before. But in general, he doesn't have to go back and say, where did I say this last time? Let me make sure I use the same verb, right? It's like he doesn't have to imitate himself. And that is something that is, a key to understanding here. All the disputed epistles are on a kind of a spectrum between the ones that are widely disputed, like the pastoral epistles. Almost nobody believes that they're authentic. And I'm not just talking about critical scholars, left-wing scholars. I've known conservative Catholic theologians like Father sorry. My brain is fried.
You're not alone.
Jerome Murphy O'Connor, right? Jerome Murphy O'Connor is a classic example. He loved 2 Timothy. He thought 2 Timothy was authentic, but he rejected 1 Timothy. There have been a number of critical, particularly conservative critical scholars in the last 15 years who've made arguments for the authenticity of some pastoral epistles, but not all of them. 1 Timothy is the one that is the hardest to defend on the merits. It doesn't have very much going for it if you're a text critic trying to say it's real. But the person did the most concerted effort is Luke Timothy Johnson, I believe, and he still mainly says that look how similar to Corinthians it is. Right? Like, wow, it's really similar to Corinthians. Well, guess what? Corinthians was the most popular early Christian text. 1 Corinthians was. That was the most widely circulated early Christian text. It is the single most influential early Christian text in the sense that all other Christian authors were inspired to some degree by it. So if a fake Pauline epistle sounds like 1 Corinthians, it just means it was written by a literate Christian in the 2nd century. That's all that means. Because you couldn't be a literate Christian in the 2nd century and not know 1 Corinthians. You might not possess any other text except that one. I mean, they weren't being circulated as codices full of all the books, right? They were more likely to appear piecemeal, like you get some but not all of the canon as we know it. And so individual authors didn't necessarily know all the text. They just knew the important ones. And that's another indication of forgery. We can see, for example, where the pastor knows things that weren't in circulation yet, right? Where texts that weren't universally known are known to the pastor, to the author of the pastoral epistles. That means that they are written late. They're written after those documents are widespread, after Christians everywhere are reading Acts and Luke, right? These are not rare texts anymore. They're now, not only are they widespread, but they're considered scripture. They've been elevated to the status of not just some guy's letters anymore. These are like holy texts. And that's what they're imitating. They're trying, so they're putting back in time. They're like producing a new document that's pretending to be an old document. And that's what all these forgers do, down to the later medieval. The act of forging apostolic texts goes on down through Christian history to the medieval period. Like liturgical manuscripts liturgical manuals written in the medieval period pretend to be written in the 4th century or the 3rd century, right? And to do that effectively, you have to figure out what a 4th century or 3rd century document should look like. And then you have to do some technical skill, right, to come across effectively. So ancient forgers could be skilled. And I think what we're dealing with is, I think that I'm leaning towards the fact that 2 Timothy is also a forgery. It's just a much better forgery. The author of 2 Timothy is much more familiar with Paul's works as a whole, right? Has a better grasp over the breadth of Paul's writings and the way and Paul's situation in the church. 2 Timothy author probably has a more natural understanding of Pauline Christianity as a whole. Whereas 1 Timothy's problem, and this is what I'm going to get at, is he's really kind of an outsider. The author of 1 Timothy is somebody who I think is coming from a perspective that is alien to the core of early Pauline Christianity, and he's trying to domesticate and reform Pauline Christianity and turn it into something that it was originally not. And I think that puts it in a different page than those other texts, which are just moving the needle slightly, right? Right. 1 Timothy's like all the way across the board. It's just it's on a different planet from real Paul, in my opinion.
This is a very interesting observation. If we look at like Acts and we compare them to Paul's letters, you find some interesting, I think, work being done by Acts to reconcile and deal with the problems in Galatians, for example. And what do? Right. You have Peter's vision. We talked to Bart Ehrman about this recently. Peter's vision. He somehow actually submits to the teaching of Paul in this respect, that Gentiles and Jews can eat together in the Christian community because we're equal. And that the whole, they're kosher, you can't eat with non-kosher, no, these animals are clean. seems very, using Mike Winger's words, propagandistic, but purposeful in trying to correct
Right.
and make Paul and Peter on the same path. And so I'm
Yeah.
interested in seeing what you might bring up with that.
So-
and the other thing is just, again, I could see the temptation from a fundamentalist point of view where you're defending God's word. You believe this is true. And so you want to go into the full maximalist case to try and say, let me make all of it authentic. Let me defend
Right.
my castle. I don't want to give one stone away.
Exactly.
I admit a single canonical text is a forgery. If I
Right.
admit if I go too far,
Right.
like these minimal fact scholars, damn it, the whole castle is going to come crumbling down.
Yeah.
I have to defend the indefensible. Of course, they don't think it's indefensible. But
Yeah.
they're willing to go to the absurd and not
Right.
even recognize some of the clear, obvious, I would
Yeah.
say, common sense observations.
That's right. And I think that, like, for example, what you're saying about Acts is clearly trying to put a round peg into a square hole in a lot of sense, in the sense that there's irreconcilable differences between early Christian factions, and Acts has them all singing Kumbaya, right? And it's like trying to make this big tent thing. And it does a pretty good job of it, honestly. I mean, when you look at it, its literary project is trying to craft a large, unified Christian movement. And it does so well, and I think that the author is a sincere proponent of this, and believes that, yeah, well, James and Paul and Peter really would have gotten along if they had just had the chance, and that we're gonna be the change we want to see in the community, right? And like, so but for many other ways, Acts and other early Christian documents still stay true to the core of early Christianity as a countercultural movement.
Right.
It didn't begin as a mainstream religion that was like practiced in the upper echelons. Where the later pastoral forgeries come in is at the time when it's starting to go mainstream. It's at the time when the religion needs to be adopted by a wider range of more like middle class Greco-Roman people who are going to be scandalized by the ways that real early Christianity was weird. It was weird and non-normative. It didn't follow Greek customs. It flaunted Greco-Roman norms in specific ways. And so the latest pastoral forgery, 1 Timothy, in my opinion, is a project to make Pauline Christianity better fit with Hellenistic cultural expectations. Does that make sense? So it's like we're moving out of the first century into the second century, through the middle second century into the third century. That's when Christianity's demographic footprint in the Roman Empire grows and grows and grows. The only way it can do that is if it's domesticated to a certain degree, if it's turned into something that's palatable and for regular Greeks and Romans. And so
totally agree.
And
John
so
Dominic Crossan says the same. Yeah. It's
right.
heading to Rome. It's heading to Rome.
So let's talk about, so I'm going to highlight a few of Eric's specific undesigned coincidences.
Okay.
In one case, he points out that 2 Timothy talks about how important 2 Timothy's mother and grandmother are. Timothy's, the historical Timothy's mother and grandmother are praised as being pious and faithful women, and his upbringing from a child in the faith, right, of his mother and grandmother is emphasized. And so this is presented as like, why would a forgery bother to make Timothy a mama's boy and to talk about how important his Christian or his Jewish Christian mother and grandmother were? That doesn't make sense, especially when we know that, it was a patriarchy where the man's pedigree was important, coming down from the father's line. If they're just making it up, why not present a good patriarchal model? And that's more likely historical. Well, remember what I said about 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy not having the same perspective? Gender is one of those issues. Why? What is the one way that 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy don't hang together? 1 Timothy is written by a misogynist, by a hardcore misogynist. 2 Timothy is not. 2 Timothy is more like the other epistles. It consistently presents women in positions of authority, right? So there's a disconnect. And let's And so the reason why Timothy's grandma is shown as a important leader in his life is because that's actually one of the things about this that makes it sound like Paul. Because Paul really did that. Paul was constantly praising women. He called women apostles and things like that. So, of course, real Paul or someone imitating real Paul is going to have him talking up someone's female ancestors as the basis for their spiritual growth and power, right? It's not. So that's I think the gender issue is the major disconnect between the brazen forgeries and the better forgeries or the gray area texts that are like on the spectrum between authentic and unknown, right? You know what I'm saying? So let me see. Where's the next slide? I'm sorry, I'm doing too many things at once here. So let's talk about the Acts of Paul, which is a really important proto-Orthodox text of the mid-second century. And so it's ultimately rejected from the canon, likely because it has a woman preacher in it, Thecla. Thecla is Paul's like right-hand woman in this thing, and she goes out. And so the reason why later proto-Orthodox authors like Tertullian of Carthage ultimately decided it was a forgery and needed to be thrown out is likely because they didn't like the way that it put women in authority. But it portrayed Paul as endorsing women clergy, as endorsing women as pastors and preachers, which obviously contradicts with the view of that presented by Paul in 1 Timothy, where he says women can't teach men, right? By the way, Acts has Priscilla teaching Apollos in a synagogue, right? Acts 18 portrays, so the proto-Orthodox movement in the 2nd century included endorsements of women being allowed to speak in church and women being allowed to teach men. We know this because the Bible contains it, right? The New Testament includes references to women speaking and teaching in synagogues, which was normal Jewish practice at the time too. Jewish women were not forbidden from speaking in synagogues. So the fact that the Acts of Paul portrays this, and the Acts of Paul clearly engages with both of the pastoral epistles to Timothy. So both 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy are subtly hinted at throughout the Acts of Paul. But here's the thing. 2 Timothy is endorsed. 1 Timothy appears to be rejected in the sense that the author of the Acts of Paul, anytime 1 Timothy's claims come up, it shows Paul and Thecla refuting them. Does that make sense? So This suggests that at this time in the church, 1 Timothy was disputed. It wasn't uniformly agreed upon as being authentic Paul. And that wouldn't even been, and we're not just talking about the Marcionites. We're not just talking about the heretics here. We're talking about within the church as a whole. We're talking about within mainstream 2nd century Christianity.
And just for our viewers who may not even know, Acts of Paul is not in your, this is not Acts of the Apostles. This is a whole nother book. Right. It's not in our canon.
It's the same genre as Acts of the Apostles.
Exactly.
It's like there were other Acts type books, and it was briefly in the proto-Catholic, proto-Orthodox canon around the decades after it was written. And we know this because I think it was endorsed by Hippolytus of Rome, who was one of the first popes / anti-popes. He's associated with the early proto-Orthodox movement. So it was not like a Marcionite text. It was a text that was meant for a proto-Orthodox audience. It would have been read by proto-Orthodox people, and it was rejected later, right? At the time that 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy were absolutely being endorsed, it was being done away with. And the explicit reason why it was rejected by, say, Tertullian of Carthage is he says Acts of Paul has things that Paul rejects in 1 Timothy, right? They cited 1 Timothy as the reason that the Acts of Paul was a forgery, right? You can't have Paul doing that. Look what he says in 1 Timothy, right?
Right.
So like, why does 1 Timothy exist? We're getting into the reason for 1 Timothy's existence. It was to help purge the church of certain things that were considered to be incorrect as the church becomes a more like established institution over time. All right. So yeah, so that's why Second Timothy has all these women. Another point is that he makes that I think is a pretty obvious mistaken use of the undesigned coincidences, is he points out that Paul's itinerary, so his travel itinerary, matches in 2 Timothy 3, 10 through 11, it matches Acts 13 and 14, where he goes from, Antioch to Iconium and then to Lystra, right? So this is allegedly some kind of undesigned coincidence. The problem is the dating of the pastoral epistles, in my opinion, is typically a little bit too old. Most people, I think it's pretty solidly clear that the pastoral epistles are 2nd century and not early 2nd century, like early to mid 2nd century. So like, I think decades into the 2nd century is when these epistles were written. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. And that the reason why 2 Timothy follows the itinerary in Acts is because the author is reading Acts.
No way.
Yeah.
You got to be kidding me.
The text is in front of them, and they're able to say, first he went here, then he went here, and then he went here afterwards. And the dating, I mean, again, I'm not going to say that all 3 pastoral epistles were written at the same time, but I think that the case for 1 Timothy being written before 140 is weak, right? I think that 1 Timothy is like mid 2nd century, just like Acts of Paul is mid 2nd century. These are all part of that same period of controversy in the church related to women's authority, related to alcohol use, related to celibacy. So these were, and related to Marcion. Marcion's the controversy, and where was Marcion's controversy? In Rome, right? So this is the Roman church in the 2nd century that's blowing up around a bunch of contentious issues. And wow, Timothy just happens to solve all of them, right? 1 Timothy, it's like a pill that's designed to fix every controversy that's from around the year 145. So there. And so on, and the proof, of course, that at least 1 Timothy was written after Luke Acts is in circulation is that 1 Timothy cites the gospel according to Luke. Or he could be citing them earlier, like Marcionite proto-gospel, because this passage is in Marcion's edition as well. But the 1 Timothy 5:18, where it quotes, quote unquote, scripture as saying the laborer deserves his wages, that some people would say, oh, that's like a paraphrase of Deuteronomy. It's not a very close paraphrase of Deuteronomy. It is, but it's all what it is literally similar to is the Greek of Luke. It's like the Greek of Luke and the Greek of 1 Timothy match very closely. So one of them might be paraphrasing Deuteronomy, but the fact that 1 Timothy is here apparently citing Luke's Greek as scripture means that it's next to impossible that he's writing before the gospel according to Luke, or a version of it, whether or not it has Luke's name attached to it yet, I don't know. A version of that gospel is in circulation at the time he's writing.
I also find it interesting how similar this is to 1 Corinthians, I think 9, where Paul says, it is written you should not muzzle an oxen while it threshes. Right. And then he's like, I'm not asking for money, folks. I work for my own, but you know.
Yeah. So what 1 Timothy is doing here is it's riffing, it's using Pauline language. So remember the model, one of the main model texts for 1 Timothy is 1 Corinthians. So he's going to be imitating that. But 1 Corinthians does not, it might cite the Deuteronomy passage about the muzzle, but it doesn't cite Luke, right? 1 Corinthians is written before, 1 Corinthians is written before Mark. Mark cites 1 Corinthians. Everybody read 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is one of like the widest spread early Christian texts, period. So the fact it is absolutely earlier in the chronological sequence than any gospel text, right? And this is pseudo-Paul, or the pastor, writing after the gospel text is not only exists, but it's widely enough circulated and it's regarded as scripture. right? So it has been elevated to canonical status. That cannot be before. And I didn't include a slide about it, but Marcion's, the anti-Gnostic passages in 1 Timothy appear to be keyed into the Marcion writing project, right? They use the specific names that Marcion used to describe his own texts, which is a strong indication that they are post-Marcionite, right? The author of 1 Timothy is responding to the controversy caused by Marcion and trying to address it and using Paul's voice as a way to do that. It is not the other way around. People say, oh, Marcion rejected this text because it didn't agree with his theology. Well, maybe he would have if it had been authentic, but he didn't reject other authentic letters that disagreed with his theology. This is, in fact, something Tertullian kept criticizing him about. Tertullian was like, why did Marcion keep this stuff? Because Marcion kept the original epistles to Paul. And when Paul cited the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, what did Marcion kept it? So Marcion wasn't actually chopping things out, at least not to the extent that the Orthodox Church maintained. Yeah, you can certainly criticize Marcion's theology as being weird or whatever, but his approach to scriptures was not, as is commonly maintained, that he just deleted whatever he didn't like. So the fact that he, generally speaking, preserved a fairly authentic early proto-Western text type of the epistles, right? But he doesn't have the pastoral epistles. That's because they weren't written yet.
They're in response to. Right.
Yeah, they're a response to him, not the other way around. Exactly. All right. So now I will go to the next slide. Okay, so finally, here's another one that I think is a very weak use in the same video of the undesigned coincidences. And that is, so in all these situations, the coincidences are where things match. Well, here we have an undesigned coincidence where they don't match. That's why I used that. I'm sorry, it's a little bit, juvenile of me, I admit. I use the heads I win, tails you lose thing. So in this case, you have this this guy Alexander, who is a backsliding coppersmith, mentioned as somebody whose faith is poor and who betrayed Paul and who will receive his reward, right, of ignominy and loss of reputation, et cetera, et cetera. And then he points out, I'm sorry, I got to advance the slide again. He points out that the closest parallel in Acts is Demetrius the silversmith. So, if he's imitating Acts, why would he change the name from Demetrius the silversmith to Alexander the coppersmith unless they're two different guys and it's historically accurate? Right. I'm sorry, you can't. So which is it? Is an undesigned coincidence where things match, or an undesigned coincidence where things don't match? Because there's a lot of reasons why things don't match, whether or not you're making a forgery, right? There's a lot of really interesting work happening around the if like early forgers had documents that were incomplete or had manuscript variants. Like we know that the synoptic tradition had a lot of significant manuscript variants. We don't know what traditions were attached to the names of these people in these situations, right? There could be alternate versions of these same accounts.
Look at Acts. Behind this. There's an Acts, another version. I can't remember if it's Byzantine source of Acts. I can't remember exactly the textual source, but it's like 7 to 9% larger than the version of Acts we have in our canon, in our Bibles today. So yeah, there's got to be floating textual traditions going on, and who knows, yeah, I get what you're saying.
So I'm not trying to sound like I don't understand a basic concept here, but it really doesn't make sense to me. How is it possible that when you're comparing two different traditions that vary in their interpretation of events, how is it an undesigned coincidence when things match or when things don't match? And they're both used to argue for authenticity.
I have to just highlight what you just said, right? This is the exact, as someone mentioned, Stephen Boyce, Eric Manning, Stephen Boyce, they came on with Tim McGrew, and I can't remember the fourth gentleman. their entire criticism of Dennis MacDonald's work was when MacDonald saw variants or differences, he thinks, and this is MacDonald's interpretation, that they're actually reacting, sometimes even criticizing the imitation of mimesis, and I can't remember the technical term, but like the very thing that they loved jabbing at what's different about mimesis by MacDonald, that it works against themselves. So what kind of excuse will they come up with at this point to try and find out, well, actually, of course, I imagine they're going to go with what you said initially. These are two different Smiths. So it's all historical. Duh. You know what I mean? Like,
that's right. It's like you read it. It's like, yeah, like Judas hanged himself and he exploded. Right. That's all at the same time. Because sometimes when you hang somebody, they explode. Yeah, it's that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, I just want to go beat my head against the desk. It's so difficult to see how the mental gymnastics work. But again, I'm not trying to belittle anyone. It's sincere. I follow the line of thinking up to a point, and then I just can't follow anymore.
Yeah, I get it.
I have to get off the bus. But so here's the last one. This was from a different video. So it turns out he has several of these videos. This one was one that I found after I looked at the one that just came up. And this one kind of concludes a very similar chain of arguments. I think this might have been the one that was addressing EHRMAN's book, Forged. And he points out the personal anecdotes in the pastoral epistles as things that no forger would bother to do. And I'm sorry, but that's not true. Forgers have to do the personal anecdotes. And the only way anyone can make a successful forgery is if they imitate the genre conventions of a real document. And you better believe it that ancient forgers knew this. You had to you had to know what you were imitating. And that would include saying things like, let me get my coat when I come back, right? That I left there, or bring my coat to me when you come. And so there's all these little personal anecdotes. And the best ones, though, and this is the one where they didn't miss, they said, like, why do these personal anecdotes there? And Mr. Manning made the case that none of these had any significance for doctrine or dogma or church rules, or the basis for this as correcting or fixing some problem with the interpretation of Paul and wanting to assert a new reading of the text. And that's wrong. In fact, some of these anecdotes, and one I'll mention specifically, absolutely was a subtle down low way of saying Paul doesn't support radical Paul. Like moderate Paul doesn't support radical Paul. So moderate Paul he's more of a misogynist. Moderate Paul believes in procreation. He believes that women should be saved through child rearing. All this is completely rejected by real Paul. Right. Fake Paul in 1 Timothy is pro-child rearing, pro-childbirth, pro-alcohol consumption. And how does he do that? How does he say, I support drinking alcohol, which is a normal Greco-Roman thing, right?
Right.
He's endorsing regular people drinking wine. He says, I heard about your tummy ache, whatever, you should take a little wine with your. So it's like this, one of these throwaway anecdotes that it's allegedly an undesigned coincidence is actually doing double duty here. It's going after the Marcionites and the other radical Paulinists who are absolutely practicing teetotaling abstinence. Total, because drunkenness is bad, so therefore we don't drink anything. Paul here doesn't agree with you. He thinks it's okay for you to have a little wine to help your tummy ache. See, so this is exactly how the two go hand in hand. In this case, the forgery is imitating a natural, normal letter, and it's dropping bombs that are going to have implications for the way that the church enforces rules of behavior in, monastic settings and everything else.
It's church political propaganda.
It's political propaganda masquerading as a personal anecdote. And this is the kind of thing that 1 Timothy is particularly heavy-handed with. Mm-hmm. The author of 1 Timothy is not an effective forgery compared to the other Deuterocanonical, Deuteropauline materials, right? The other Deuteropauline materials are all much better written because they manage to integrate genuine Pauline material so artfully with a thing that they're changing. Like, for example, let's talk about one of the ones that's really on the fence. 2 Thessalonians. It's so similar to 1 Thessalonians in so many ways, right? All it does is tweak like eschatological issues. It's like it's got a few. It was trying to probably replace it. They wanted to supplant 1 Thessalonians with 2 Thessalonians. Whoever's making that one has got a very, very modest, narrow agenda, right? And they're just going after that one thing. So most of these likely forgeries are so subtle that there's room for debate. Like, real scholars can absolutely differ. And I'm not saying that real scholars can't differ about the pastoral epistles too. BART Ehrman has said so many times, there are plenty of good scholars who disagree, and I'm not bashing anyone. But I'm saying that there's a reason why there's only a small handful of critical scholars, like a tiny handful of critical scholars that defend 1 Timothy. And they are, generally speaking, come from the traditionalist wing of Christianity themselves, right? So they are people who have a vested interest in, defending the authenticity of the canon and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a religious bias that is inherent to people. It's not a moral failing, but it's different from critical scholars who are able to suspend their judgment, or at least constrain the biases of, I believe the religion is true, I want the Bible to be what it says it is, but I'm going to still allow my brain to tell me when something is not right. Like, I'm not going to pinch my nose and say, yes, it's real Paul, right? It's like there's too many things, too many red flags here for me. So this is the one epistle, 1 Timothy, that I'm willing to really go to the mat for. Like, I'm going to go all the way and say, nobody can convince me that this is real Paul. It's just, he's too un-Pauline in too many ways.
Real quick on that point.
Yeah.
I did a course with Del C. Allison Jr. We called it the quest for the historical Jesus quest. And all he does is go through the history of the scholarship. It was amazing for me, who doesn't know the history that well of the scholarship and how it developed. But just for those, because there's such a quote unquote atheist versus apologist online stuff. And of course, we feed into it for views and to get people attentive. And even the title here, right? We want to grab people's attention and get them into this back and forth dilemma. But I just want to highlight, for those who may not know, all of the critical scholarship you are hearing today, everything that you're talking about, Joe, everything that we do on MythVision, maybe not every single thing that's ever postulated, but mythologies, finding legends, forgeries, issues, textual traditions, contradictions, everything you see me do, initiated thanks to the Protestant Reformation, Christians within their own tradition, after scalpeling, using a scalpel and cutting all the fake miracles of the Catholic Church when they were going back and forth protesting against the Catholic Church, eventually turned the scalpel to their own textual tradition, wanting to authenticate, wanting to verify, using kind of a science on the text. And over the centuries, thanks to Christian men mostly, I'd say almost all, Christians were the ones who did this project. And so it's not an atheist bias to do everything you see us doing today. This is a Christian project, technically, on Christian literature. And
it was among the most influential liberal theologians in the early modern period that led to the most liberal Protestant theology in the early modern period, is where skepticism about the pastoral epistles originates. And because they're the most flagrant, they were the ones recognized first. 1807, I think, so like 217 years ago or something like that, was about when they first said 1 Timothy is not Paul. That when the first academic publications, again written by Bible-believing Christians, these were Protestants who believed in sola scriptura and all that. This was like this. These were not heretics. But just as Martin Luther, because I'm not a huge fan of Martin Luther as a historical individual. He had lots of issues, but he was a text critic. He wanted to reject the later, why did the Christian Apocrypha, why did the apocryphal Jewish Greek texts get kicked out of the Protestant Bible? Because the Protestant Reformation at its very foundation was about judging authenticity of texts and finding the texts that weren't deemed authentic and rejecting them, no matter what the Catholics had previously done. You see what I'm saying?
Right, I do.
So that's why in the early 19th century, it wasn't considered wrong to want to get rid of or to declare when something was a fake book in the Bible. That wasn't considered blasphemous or an attack on the Bible itself. This was part of the part and parcel of what the Reformation was about. It was about critically examining texts and determining which ones we can trust. And yes, indeed, they recognized, because of a whole bunch of issues, they recognized that First Timothy was the one that had the red flags, where Paul is arguing against Paul, right? In fact, the entire thing is basically Paul undermining Paul. So if your entire career is based on understanding Paul, and then you read something where it sounds like Paul doesn't like Paul, right? Then it's like the fact that he imitates the language of Paul to do it doesn't change the fact, right? The vocabulary similarity is not enough. The fact that he copies word for word text out of 1 Corinthians is not enough if he turns 1 Corinthians on its head at every opportunity, which is kind of what's happening. Okay, so
sorry for the tangent.
Oh no, the tangent was great. So let me just talk a little bit about, again, we're going to get into I told you we would do a little bit for the next few minutes about the context, the historical context of Christianity in the 2nd century.
I'm going to use the restroom real quick while you're covering this.
Do you want me to keep going? Just pretend you're still here?
Absolutely. Pretend I'm here. Yeah. The counter forged Derek is going to be here. You ready for this? Here we are.
All right. So to the audience that's still here, this is the famous work of Celsus, which survives only in excerpts quoted by Origen of Alexandria. Celsus wrote the first comprehensive pagan critique of Christianity. And what's ironic is that both he and Origen were Greco-Roman socially conservative traditionalists. They actually, in terms of their social politics, they agreed more than they disagreed. What they disagreed about was the moral virtue of Christianity. And so one of the things that Celsus was most mocking about Christianity was the fact that it was a religion of the socially marginalized, the people who were beneath contempt in Greco-Roman society. So the fact that Christianity was a religion that appealed to women, children, and slaves, right? These three categories of people were all deemed less than full human rights. They were given less than full human rights under Greco-Roman law. They were all considered to be, to some degree, subhuman, right? Not only a free man of means was able to fully exercise his human agency. So any religion that was catering to women, slaves, and children was inherently worthy of mockery, according to Celsus. And so this touched a nerve, because the reality is that Christianity was a religion of women, children, and slaves. I mean, Jesus saying, "Let the little children come to me," in both the canonical and non-canonical gospels, and the fact that Paul says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ." This is the idea that is kind of central to Pauline Christianity. That passage in Galatians is one of the animating, driving forces behind the movement. It is an incredibly important idea. The social leveling of Christianity, the way that it transforms the social hierarchies of Greco-Roman society, is what makes it subversive from the perspective of socially conservative pagans like Celsus. And so it's as in the 3rd century, a social conservative wing is rising in proto-Orthodox Christianity, that they're saying, "Oh no, that's not us." They're sort of they're trying, and by the way, they do say, yes, of course we have holy women, very holy women. They're made holy despite the fact that there are inferiors, right? Our religion is powerful enough to make even inferior women holy. See, this is kind of like, it's, in other words, the church is reorienting itself towards the expectations of the Greco-Roman elites. Like they're embarrassed by some of these qualities of their social history and the characteristics of the movement up until the 2nd century. And so this is one of the things that causes the pastoral forgeries to gain prominence over time. But you can see this is definitely still the case as late as the early 4th century, where the Diocletianic seizure of property in Algeria in 303. So there's a large church wardrobe that's confiscated in the period of sporadic persecution that happened there in North Africa. It had a 5-to-1 ratio of women's garments to men's garments. The earliest Christian liturgical iconography consistently shows women, often without veils, often preaching next to altars. You find early Christian women's graves containing Eucharistic paraphernalia. The material culture of the sacraments are associated with women's bodies in the most prominent graves in the oldest church cemeteries we've excavated. And this keeps happening. And it's not just the heretics. It's not just the Marcionites. It is early proto-Orthodox and early proto-Catholic communities that had high-ranking women clergy across the board. And and the more we excavate, the more we recognize this. And this, again, put early Christianity for the first several years, made it really countercultural and weird, because Greek law said that women were effectively chattel slaves, right? They were legally children. And there's nothing similar attributed to Moses in the Torah, right? This is not, yes, I'm not saying that the Jews were enlightened on gender, but ancient Judaism was not like Greco-Romans were in terms of their treatment of women and slaves. So let's just talk about how these attitudes are reflected briefly in some ancient Greek and Roman laws. Going all the way back to Aristotle is where you have the legal prohibition on women's speech in public, right? So Aristotle's Politics forbids women's public speech. Livy quotes Cato the Elder. So the context of the quote is the reign of Augustus, so when Jesus is a little kid. But the context of the quote is Cato around the 2nd century BC. The repeal of the Oppian Law, which happened after like the Hannibal crisis, was originally prohibiting ostentatious displays by men and women, but it was amended in the early 2nd century BCE to make it so only women were forced to remain quiet in public assemblies, right? Philo of Alexandria, who's the one Jewish author on my list here, he writes an allegory about the oral Torah, which makes it conform to Greco-Roman law. He's trying to say Jews can be good Greco-Roman gender traditionalists too. Juvenal, again, condemns women from publicly intruding and speaking during male governance in the assemblies. So when Pauline Christianity silences and subordinates women, it's an imitation of the Greco-Roman gender rules. And we've talked about this in the other video. The authentic Pauline epistles has the famous passage in Corinthians, which is problematic about this too, which I believe is a quotation refutation formula. That's another issue. We don't have time to get into all that today. But suffice it to say that the pastoral epistles are channeling Aristotle, right? Particularly, I should say, 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy is like an Aristotelian virtue ethics manual. It's doing things proper from this Greco-Roman perspective and flaunting the earlier authentic Pauline social leveling. So Derek, are you familiar with the work about Paul and the Stoics?
I am. I've read a few scholars that have written on this, that Paul was probably engaging with Stoic thought as well as Middle Platonism to some degree.
So Plato was less of a misogynist than his student Aristotle was. The Stoics believed that you could attain freedom through slavery, right? So there was some Stoic thought there was this sort of conflation of the the slave and the free are one, right? That's the notion that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and the one is on top shall be on the bottom, and the one that's on the bottom shall be on the top. That kind of stuff. Epicureans were also among the earliest anti-slavery philosophical movements, right? Epicureans sometimes forbade their practitioners from holding slaves. They said you had to emancipate your slaves, right, and give them what they needed to live an independent life, right? So this is like the earliest roots of intellectual opposition to slavery, and Paul is portrayed as convincing Epicureans and Stoics in the Agora in Acts 17. Right. He is. So these are the strands of pagan philosophy that Christianity is aligning itself with in the proto-Orthodox movement in the early 2nd century.
It just seems their problem at the end was the bodily resurrection idea at resurrection. So that seemed to be the hiccup.
But in terms of the way that these socially marginalized groups are propped up and presented as paragons, rather than being scorned and cast aside the way normal Greco-Roman views like following Aristotle would. That's a really interesting thing. Something that I'm talking to our friend Chrissy Hansen, who's doing some amazing work on Philemon lately, and she's supporting that she thinks Philemon is a forgery too. I'm not sure I go as far as she does there, but through our dialogues, I've come to realize that Philemon is likely a pseudonym for an anonymous slave owner, and that the author Philemon, Paul, I think, Chrissy thinks it's a forgery, but the author of Philemon chose the name Philemon because Philemon is a famous comic from. Philemon the comic is an anti-Aristotelian, anti-slavery comedian. So the fact that the slave owner is named Philemon in a discourse about recognizing the slave as your brother, right?
How ironic that slavery is a significant point in a letter by a guy named Philemon, right? Right,
exactly. So whoever, because Paul picks nicknames for people. He doesn't just name them what they are, especially if you're like in a kind of a subversive secret sect that's, you're going to send your letters with, you might have code names or something for your recipients. So this is all just to say that there is a strongly anti-Aristotelian ethos, in my opinion, in the early kernel of the Pauline corpus, but these later Pauline pseudo-Pauline epistles, like 1 Timothy most brazenly, is Aristotelian virtue ethics manifested. It's like basically the opposite. It could not be more different in terms of its ethos. And so just to remind you I keep trying to click on the other panel to make the screen switch, and I'm inept. I'm a Luddite. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. So just to remind you what this notorious passage, which is the Christianization of Aristotelian and Greco-Roman gender normativity, is where it says, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. There's another one of those red flags. Like, where does Paul say, with good works of the law, right? What is good work? In the other passage in Corinthians, this is imitating, it mentions the law. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Again, this is explicitly drawn from Greco-Roman law of that period, right? It was wrong for women to learn from men. It was wrong for women to speak in public in the assemblies, etc. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, yet she will be saved through childbearing with modesty. So here we have numerous un-Pauline ideas. We have the vaunting of good works like good deeds, as opposed to works in the law, which were like following Torah observance in real Paul, right? So there's a disconnect between the language is the same, but the meaning is totally different. There is the complete, the mechanistic imitation of Greco-Roman law about women's place, women's roles. There's also the reversal of Adam as the transgressor. If you read Romans, the quintessential transgressor for Paul is Adam.
Right.
Paul blames the dude. This is where Paul says, did I say Adam was the bad guy? It's actually Eve. She was the problem, right? And then real Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 is absolutely tells you do not have kids. Nobody should be having
he's
kids.
like,
and here he's
the end
like,
is about to happen. Yeah.
Here he's like, the only way for a woman to be saved. So you go from, it's absolutely horrible to have children too. The only way for a woman to be saved is if she has kids, right? This is complete inversion. And these are just a small handful. So I also talked about alcohol use. Also, the very important issues of blasphemy and personal conscience. For Paul, blasphemy is never a concern if you have the Spirit, right?
Right.
A good spirit means blasphemy is impossible. Yet 1 Timothy is extremely paranoid about blasphemy and how do we stop it, right? Personal conscience is your guide for real Paul. He is leading a charismatic movement where people who have the Spirit have absolutely nothing to worry about. They will not blaspheme. They allow the Spirit to help guide their personal conscience, and they are in great shape, right? That is perfect. Whereas, again, this guy is worried about people being led astray by their personal conscience, right? So there's this it's like numerous technical terms from 1 Corinthians get tweaked to mean pretty much exactly the opposite of what they mean in their original context. This is an author who is using Paul's voice to fix Paul so that Paul is now doing the exact opposite of what Paul's supposed to be doing. Anyway, and so this goes beyond the stylometric problems. All the stylometric problems are real. They are not insignificant, but it's like this stuff on top of everything else, right? There are internal evidence, external evidence, content, dogma. Like there is no category of analysis under which I think 1 Timothy doesn't pretty much resoundingly fail the authenticity test, right? More so than any other epistle, in my opinion. Some people put Ephesians in that category too, because it's got its own problems. But this is the one that I am pretty convinced about. Okay, so let me go another slide forward. How are we doing for time? I got
good.
15 or 20 more minutes at least.
I'm yours here. We do have super chats, but it's like we got six super chats to recognize.
All right, so so if you give me another 10 minutes, we can get through some super chats before I have to leave. Okay. All right. So just the external evidence, it doesn't appear in Codex Vaticanus. None of the pastorals appear in Papyrus 46. Well, it's true that there are some missing pages at the end of Papyrus 46. There are not enough of them to contain all the missing epistles. So there's like Philemon and a few others are missing too. But in other words, there are definitely something missing from Papyrus 46. We cannot confirm that the pastoral epistles occur in either of those sources. Do not occur in Marcion's canon list. As I said, it's unevenly defended by the proto-Orthodox. So we know several heretics rejected the epistles, but some proto-Orthodox, like Tatian the Assyrian, did. I also mentioned already that Tertullian was shocked by the fact that Marcion included Old Testament passages that were contrary to his weird theology, and he thought this was really, really strange. So again, the argument that the pastoral epistles were rejected by the Marcionites on the basis of theological differences, it doesn't hang, because the Marcionites would have had the same cause to reject other texts that also didn't agree with their theology. The fact is they accepted the text because they thought they were written by Paul, and that's the basis for their inclusion, right? And so I think this is the last important slide for me to talk about, and then we should go ahead and do some super chats. I'll do one more after this. Is just to say that this is an important time in the late Roman Empire, the mid to late 2nd century, which is when these epistles are first openly cited as the work of Paul. Yes, earlier authors like Polycarp and the Acts of Paul appear to allude to them, to mention their themes and issues. But like in the case of Polycarp, he's writing at the same time that I believe the epistles are being written, and he's writing in the same context. So why is Polycarp so similar to 1 Timothy? Because they might even be in the same community, right? These are so close together in terms of historical context that you can't use Polycarp to defend 1 Timothy if Polycarp is 1 Timothy, right? It's like some people say Polycarp might even be the author of 1 Timothy. The language is so similar, right? And the genre and the purpose is so similar. First, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians or whatever it is. It's like they quote the same text. They have. So there is a clear literary relationship between what's going on in Polycarp's time and what's going on at the time that the pastoral forgeries are being composed. So yeah, and this is also a period when Montanism, which is a female-led proto-Orthodox charismatic movement, right, in Asia Minor, and so there's rapidly expanding women-led movements that are being opposed, right, by other factions in the proto-Orthodox Church at a time when the demographic expansion of Christianity is happening. The Western text type manuscript tradition is being composed at this time, and it includes numerous redactions in favor of the pastoral epistles and other pseudo-Pauline material where the text is harmonized. So like people must have recognized there was some grammatical incongruities. The scribes in the Western text type tended to make the canonical Pauline material more closely resemble the disputed material, if that makes sense, through subtle changes in language. And then finally, I'll just point out one thing. So I was going to show some manuscript variants, but I don't think I have time. I don't quite have time to go through those in detail, so we'll skip that slide. We'll say that this Pope Gelasius I, he has attributed one of his things to the fact that he was complaining around the year 496 that women were still doing sacramental stuff in the church in the late 5th, early 6th century, right? So that attributed to this pope is a complaint about the fact that women were still being ordained, not within as leaders, not within the heretical churches, but within mainstream normal Christianity of that period.
So there's different veins based on different literature, it seems, still
existing. That would suggest that the notion that everyone read 1 Timothy as scripture is undermined by that. And even, by the way, even this Pope Gelasius text that I show you is widely considered to be a canonical, not a canonical forgery, but a forgery. It's likely it was written by someone pretending to be the guy about 50 years later. So yeah. So it's like a mid 6th century forgery written in Gaul.
Wow.
Like so that's it. So let's do some super chats because I do have to leave in about 10 minutes. So
awesome. Yeah, this has been a blast, I'm sure. By the way, Eric showed up in the chat while we were streaming.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for your good faith and your spirit in letting me do this. I know I didn't ask permission first, but I know you're a good guy and you'll respect us.
He may want to have a conversation with you, he said, if you're down.
Yeah.
We'll plan it. We'll figure out something. Stop Scamming Man. Thank you so much for all the support through all the super chats and the questions. 1 Corinthians 15 says Jesus appeared to Cephas, Peter, then the 12, then 500 people, then to James. Were the historical James and Peter not of the 12? A little off topic, but
yeah, the Peter question is more confusing because you would think that Peter was. I'm not sure but again, the Gospels are written later than, right? The Gospels are later than 1 Corinthians. So whether Peter was or not is hard to say. Paul wasn't in the Petrine faction. So yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. The identity of the 12.
I agree.
There's a number of problems, and some of those, the identity of the 12 was an issue for early editors because sometimes they changed the Pauline manuscripts to reflect, like the Western edition. They corrected 12 to 11 at one point. Why? Because Judas is
Exactly.
Dead.
Well, I was literally just going to say in the Gospel of Matthew, verse 28 or chapter 28, sorry, verse for those who are interested,
Right.
16, the Great Commission narrative. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountaintop where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, notice there's like a
Right.
witness tradition, 11, not 12. And
Right.
so,
And
you
so
know,
I remember I told you the Western manuscript tradition of the epistles was
Right.
heavily edited to make it harmonize across the texts.
Mhm.
That was one of the editorial changes that they did. If you read the Western text type recension of this passage, it says 11, not 12.
Got it. Thank you.
They had to fix the continuity error. They were retconning it.
David Aaron Hill with the super sticker. Thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate it. Stop Scamming Man is back again. Another interesting insight it gives on the Times social views. Is it saying widows over 60 should be entitled to parish benefits? People died sooner, but their views of old were not so different. Or I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a great. Well, I'm not sure. I understand the question. Is there a question there?
I don't know if that's like that's why I was asking. I wonder if it was a question.
Okay. But thank you, Stop Scamming Man, again for your. I've seen you here before. You've been on super chats with me before. I appreciate you supporting Derek and his
Absolutely
fine enterprise.
I hope we're not skipping right over this. That if that was a question, thank you for that. Again, Stop Scamming Man. Are there any interesting details when it comes to textual variants on 2 Timothy?
That's a good question. I don't know of any big deal ones. I think the textual variants in the authentic epistles are more numerous because there are more copies floating around. They have longer traditions, right? And so there were already variant manuscripts in circulation. Like I think that some of the forgeries may have depended on some manuscript corruptions that happened before the forgeries were made. I honestly don't know. I do know that sometimes that, again, when they were doing the revisions across the epistles, that they would take language from the pastoral epistles and that would influence the way transcriptions were made in the authentic epistles. Like there would be subtle grammatical harmonizations, if that makes sense. So that would make it sound like all the same voice.
Thank you so much, Stop Scamming Man. Doc Pluromanaut, where do you fall on the Timothy equals Titus equation? Compare Paul, Saul, Silas, Silvanus,
right.
Jesus, justice, etc. Timothy means honoring God.
My friend and colleague Richard Fellows is somebody who works on similar issues to me in this area. He's doing work on Philemon. He's like Chrissy is. He's doing not exactly the same perspective she has, but he's doing relevant stuff on these kind of questions, the relationship between the authentic and the forgery, the authentic and forged epistles. And he is he's an expert on names in Greek and Roman society at that period. And he knows, he definitely believes that Timothy and Titus are the same person, but the pastoral forger didn't know that. So that I'm pretty sure Richard Fellows would agree with me. I'm not sure if he's a fan of your show, but I'll ask him in an email later. He would say that Timothy and Titus were titles for the same guy, the same historical person, but the pastoral forgers the one who did Timothy and the one who did Titus didn't. Second Timothy and Titus or whatever were unaware of the fact that that was actually the same person. And then I think maybe is it in First Timothy at one point they get in the pastoral epistles they get separated and become different individuals, like they're mentioned as independent individuals. But in the authentic epistles, the case that they're actually the same guy is pretty strong. That Titus is like a title for Timothy.
I just want to make one observation of this, not knowing any of the evidence here, and we got one more super chat after this.
All right,
is simply this. The confidence people have, the certitude that they run with on these texts, and having so much confidence in the canonical and the biblical. And I had that confidence when I was a Christian. This was the word of God, and you could not persuade me otherwise. In fact, rather than trying to engage and act like I had the one up on you, I would go to Christian apologists, listen to them, or ignore and just label you guys as liberal. I would just put you in this category and it would block out. I did not even give you guys the chance to investigate. That's why I never really knew this side of the arguments and stuff, because I was very conservative Christianity and this is the truth and really wasn't engaging with that. So I just want to say all of this discussion makes me realize, of course, more and more as I've been doing MythVision now 4 years, how much non-confidence you should have on the facts of how reliable these texts are really going back to something that is the truth, capital T. Christians have lived forever, with more of a church tradition angle and not so much textually based as if this is the word of God and we have to have this almost Bible worship perception in a way. I'm not saying that's what they're all doing, but like if the text is forged, if the Christianity will still be alive. These people thrived on the lessons and the stories as having meaning and not necessarily the technical actual reality of So that's like post-enlightenment. It seems like we have to have this actually be the case.
Right. Yeah. And as somebody who does ancient history and archaeology, I live with uncertainty. Right. I have to maintain an agnostic position. Like I say, I'm putting all the chips on one Tim being fake, but it's not like I don't worry that my eternal soul depends on my answer being correct. So and for most of these questions, I'm like, whatever. I'm like, it's cool. It's an entertaining question, but my life won't change whether or not this or that fact falls on this or that side. Right. So it's more a big picture argument that I'm committing to here rather than one that's based on just the narrow authenticity question of one text.
Last it. Yep, I imagine. Thank you, Stop Scamming Man.
Stop Scamming Man he's your sugar daddy. He's got it going on.
I imagine the biggest barrier for many aspiring researchers is learning languages. Any advice from experience? Maybe MythVision could be a good platform for relaying good advice. It hosts scholars with great linguistic skills.
Yes, and I am not one of them. So I'm going to be absolutely frank here and say that I studied a few years of Latin as an undergrad, and so I have, and it's super rusty. And then in grad school, I studied Central Asian languages, and I studied, so I'm interested in like big East-West picture, cultural exchanges and stuff like that. I'm coming back into this New Testament work, which I did again as an undergraduate many years later, and I would never claim to be an expert at the Greek or Latin. So if you want to make a career in this is a side issue in my career, which is mostly in archaeology, right? If you want to make a career in this, you absolutely should invest in good language education. Unfortunately, in the United States, you look like you're in England because you're paying in pounds sterling. Stop Scamming Man. But in the United States, unfortunately, they're just slashing the budgets for ancient language programs. So I'm in a department right now, right, where we're fighting as a faculty to keep the support for teaching Greek and Latin and Hittite and all the other languages of classical antiquity. So yeah, if you want to come and go to grad school in Massachusetts, I can point you to some of my colleagues who can teach you a lot better than me on the issue of ancient languages. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson. Everybody, remember the name. He'll be back. You already know. It's always a blast having you on. You can support us joining the Patreon, become a YouTube member. You'll get notified, of course, and have a symbol next to your name in the live chat when we do live streams. I am going to be doing private Patreon and YouTube membership Zooms, and that's coming soon, like very, very soon, now that I got back from vacation. And of course, we also have courses with academics, scholarly courses that you can take and learn what they are specialized in and what they're teaching you on Paul and New Testament stuff, Dead Sea Scrolls, the list goes on and on. Kipp Davis is in there. He's in the chat. James Tabor. We got a whole bunch of people that we have courses with, and we have more coming. So stay tuned. Any final words from you, Joe?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing it this last minute. Thanks to Eric for his being a good sport. I'm glad we live in a world where people can be collegial and people can take a little criticism and not take it personally. It's hard coming from the social media side of things where You just deal with trolls that are always on fire. And I much prefer the collegiality that you have created with this channel, Derek. It is so cool that you have people with different ideas and different perspectives that can get along and talk about all kinds of cool stuff. And so it's a privilege to be on your channel. And thank you again for allowing this last minute little thing.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, everybody who liked, share this, comment, and never forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.